Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Trust Psyche YouTube channel. I'm Jessica DiRuzza, and today we're going to be talking about neurodivergent and the birth chart. I want to begin by sharing with you a little bit about myself and then defining some of the terms that I'm going to be using in this video to make sure that we're all on the same page. I'm a licensed psychotherapist. I've been in private practice with individuals and couples for 14 years. I'm also a professional astrologer for almost 20 years. And my life's work and calling is blending the two together in all the offerings that we do here at Trust Psyche. I also am an educator. I run an online astrology school with my husband, Travis DiRuzza, where we offer courses from beginner astrologers to professionals. And we love what we do here. So I want to also share with you that something that's really important to me in my life is neurodivergence and neurodiversity. A reason for that is I am autistic. I come from a lineage of people who are autistic. And I also have a 5-year-old autistic daughter who is minimally speaking. And it has been a very big part of my life over the last 5 years. I also have about three-fourths of the people in my psychotherapy practice who are neurodivergent. And I think that's because, on some intuitive or instinctual level, the people who feel called to work with me often probably recognize my neurodivergence and either feel a resonance or a fit or a knowing and reach out to me. And then also because now I'm public about that. So I want to simply break down what neurodivergence is and one understanding of it and my understanding of it, the way that I like to hold it in the most neuroaffirming way possible. So, first, let's start with neurodiversity. Neurodiversity refers to the natural range of the ways that human brains think, feel, process, and perceive the world. It frames neurological differences as variations, not deficits, much like personality, temperament, or archetypal patterns, right? We all have different birth charts, we all have different personalities and temperaments, but we also have different neurotypes, and that's what gives us neurodiversity. Neurodivergence, or being neurodivergent, describes an individual whose neurological wiring diverges from what a culture defines as typical or normative. And this can include, but is not limited to, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, apraxia, Tourette's, and bipolar, and other differences in cognition, sensory processing, attention, or emotional regulation. Neurotypical refers to people whose cognitive functioning aligns with the dominant social expectations and systems, especially around attention, communication, learning, and regulation. Um, so another thing I want to enter in here is oftentimes you hear someone like a person will say that they have an autism diagnosis or an ADHD diagnosis. And though that is often the clinical terms that are used, coming more from a medical model, I prefer to use the word designation instead of diagnosis. I actually recently came into this term from my own therapist, and I just find it to be so much more affirming and, you know, anti-pathologizing, essentially, especially within disability justice. So, designation simply emphasizes that it's a classification or identification without assuming pathology. Whereas diagnosis, again, comes from more of a medical model. It implies illness, disorder, or something wrong that needs to be fixed. And I in no way see that whatsoever. I see every human being and every neurotype having strengths and then areas of support or gifts, and then the challenges that go with those gifts. So you might hear someone say something like, I have an autism designation, or I am ADHD designated. And that's just more of like a neuroaffirming way to talk about what usually is described as a diagnosis or a disorder. So I now want to briefly describe what autism is, because it's often misunderstood, and I misunderstood it and until my daughter got an autism designation. And I just want to be clear here about how we can all begin to understand better what autism is and what it's not. So, autism is simply primarily a difference in perception, sensory processing, communication, and meaning making. Common characteristics is sensory sensitivity or seeking. So it's a heightened or reduced sensitivity to sound, light, texture, smell, or internal sensations. So you can be hyper, which would be heightened, or hypo, which would be reduced. There's often also a deep focus and intensity of interest. So strong absorbing interest, capacity for sustained attention when engaged. Sometimes people describe this as monotroping or going down rabbit holes, where essentially you focus on a special interest and the rest of the world disappears. Truly, that's the experience of it subjectively. There's also differences in social communication. So autistic people have less reliance on implicit social cues. So there's often a preference for clarity, directness, or authenticity over social performance. Social performance can be very confusing because it's an abstract, assumed set of rules and norms that often aren't spoken out loud but are implied. There's often a need for predictability and structure. Routines help regulate the nervous system and reduce overwhelm. And then this is an interesting part about the thinking, is it can either be literal or pattern-based, or a combination of the two. So a strong pattern recognition, hello astrologers, and a tendency towards precision, honesty, and consistency. And then lastly, there's an emotional depth that is often misunderstood. Feelings are often intense, but expressed differently than cultural norms would expect. So autism is not a lack of empathy whatsoever, but it's more how there's a difference in how that empathy is expressed and perceived. I'm briefly going to go into ADHD. So ADHD is primarily about attention regulation, impulse modulation, and nervous system arousal. It's not a deficit of attention, but a difference in how attention flows. So a common characteristic is variable attention, meaning there's difficulty in sustaining attention on low interest tasks, but a hyper focus on high interest ones. So there really needs to be that strong interest in order to sustain the attention. And once that's there, and it's an incredible amount of focus, like a laser beam focus. There's often impulsivity, so there's quick action, speech, or emotional responses, often very intuitive, creative, and fast. Executive functions differences. So there's challenges with time, sequencing, organization, initiation, and follow through. This is often where we need to see a lot of support and accommodation. There's often a high energy or internal restlessness that can show up physically, or a really busy racing mind. There's an emotional intensity with strong feelings, quick shifts, sensitivity to rejection or criticism. And then lastly, there's a lot of creativity and novelty seeking. It's very Uranian in that sense. It's a strong drive towards stimulation, innovation, and new possibilities. And of course, a lot of folks who are neurodivergent can be both ADHD and autistic. And very briefly, that's like usually a combination of like sensory sensitivity with emotional intensity, burnout from masking, and feeling out of sync with dominant social rhythms, and also feeling like a very high sense of creativity and insight, but paired with overwhelm. So, what I want to talk about with you today is how I understand neurodivergence and the birth chart. And this is going to be like my main thesis that I'm presenting to you today. And then I'm going to go in and give specific examples with different astrological combinations or aspects that we can see. So, this distinction is really core to how I work. It's the lens, the framework, and the worldview that I come from when holding neurodivergence or neurodiversity and astrology together. As I mentioned before, about 3/4 of my practice is neurodivergent, and I also primarily work with therapists, coaches, and people in the healing arts, which by and large are often folks who are neurodivergent. People who are neurodivergent often are called to the helping or healing professions because of our profound sensitivity. A lot of times we're described as HSPs, highly sensitive people, but as things are evolving with our understandings with neurotypes, we're getting a better indication that a lot of these folks, like myself, are actually autistic or ADHD. And yeah, I guess I'm what's called a therapist, which I just love, which means that I get to work with people who are supporting other people. And so I've gotten a lot of data over the years about seeing how the neurotype of a neurodivergent person would express itself through one's birth chart. So this is kind of my core framing of what I'm saying here is that the birth chart does not diagnose or give a designation of a neurotype. Any chart, regardless of the aspects, the planets, or the configurations, can be lived as neurodivergent or neurotypical. The chart doesn't cause neurodivergence, but neurodivergence instead expresses through it. And the chart also expresses itself through the neurotype that is present. So the neurotype is like the medium through which the chart is expressed, and the chart is the pattern that we're looking at and understanding. So when someone is neurodivergent, the archetypal patterns of the chart are filtered through that nervous system, perception style, and way of making meaning. And I'm going to give examples of this. But this would be very akin to like, we cannot look at a birth chart and know someone's ethnicity. We cannot look at a birth chart and know someone's sexual orientation. We cannot look at a birth chart and know the person's religion, right? These things are, in a way, separate from the birth chart. But when it comes to something like your neurotype, this is actually a priori. So our neurotype is largely genetic. It's, considered to be, for example, with autism, it's 80 to 90% inherited. That's why we see lineages or lines of certain neurotypes. And it's believed that roughly about 10% of the population is probably autistic. So 1 in 10, which would be the same with ADHD. So what I'm saying here is that your neurotype is something that you have that you were born with, and then the birth chart is the archetypal pattern of the moment in which you incarnate. So now let's start to give some examples of how different astrological aspects would express themselves in certain ways similarly, but then differently if one is neurodivergent versus neurotypical. So let's start with Mercury Saturn. This could be any major aspect of Mercury Saturn. It could be a conjunction, opposition, square, trine, or sextile. Let's just imagine for a moment it's a conjunction, but truly any of the 5 major aspects. So if someone has Mercury Saturn and they're autistic, then often what I see is that autistic person may express as exceptionally literal thinking, with precision with language or numbers, and a strong need for mental routines or an affinity for things like engineering, systems, structure, architecture, the infrastructure of the mind, and the infrastructure of the physical material world. There's a strong fascination with this, and often one's special interest and hyper focus is on things that have to do with a precision in language and numbers. So it's very logical, rational, mathematical. Now, this is already true for a Mercury Saturn person, whether they're neurotypical or not, but it's, I think, even more amplified with someone who is neurodivergent, because what we understand about, for example, the autistic brain is that it doesn't have the same filter that a neurotypical brain does. Quite literally, there's a pruning process that the brain goes through when we're extremely young as children. And a neurotypical brain prunes all of these different neurons and pathways that it decides it's not going to get much use out of. Well, an autistic brain doesn't go through that pruning process, which why an autistic brain both has often sensory processing things, not able to filter out in the same way light and sound and touch and smell that a neurotypical brain does, but also has a heightened pattern recognition, which is, again, why I think a lot of people who are autistic are drawn to things like astrology, because it's all about pattern recognition. So another way that we could describe this is that astrology can describe how a psyche organizes meaning, but not why a neurotype exists. And from a depth psychological perspective, neurodivergence shapes the ego nervous system interface through which the archetypal material is metabolized. So let's give another example here of Mercury Uranus in any major aspect. So we would think of here of the archetype of like a nonlinear thinker, insight, disruption, originality. So in a neurodivergent person, especially someone with ADHD or autism, Mercury Uranus may express as rapid pattern recognition, associative thinking, sudden insights, or an intuitive leapfrogging over steps that others would need. So others might need a sequential, linear, step-by-step, A, B, C, this is how we get there. But a neurodivergent person with Mercury Uranus would be able to skip over those steps. So that rapid thinking, but also that associative connection, it doesn't need all the steps to get to that intuitive insight and knowing that often is described as foresight or precognitive. Also here you would see really fast speech, and ideas may arrive fully formed rather than sequentially. So it can kind of feel just like a transmission or a download that comes at once. So in a neurotypical expression of Mercury Uranus, the same aspect might show up as an intellectual independence or innovative ideas or unconventional communication, but without the same intensity of the cognitive speed or sensory overload. So someone who is ADHD and has Mercury Uranus oftentimes will go into these periods of hyperarousal and hyperfocus when they're very excited about an idea, usually a new idea where there's a strong dopamine hit. And when that's happening and they're excited about it, they can give their whole being over to it, right? Their whole soul, their whole mind, their whole everything, and come out the other side. And there can be this incredible creative output of producing something extremely innovative and novel and exciting. But then there's often this kind of drop and exhaustion or fatigue where there's a need for deep rest and kind of turning off or tuning out after going through the period of hyperarousal and hyperfocus. So there's a peak and then there's a dip there's a huge surge and then there's a waning of energy, especially once the novelty and the excitement and the dopamine in the hyper-focused tunnel has come to its completion. And so these processes are cyclical. I can't even say that word right now. Oh my gosh, said it a million times. And it's cyclical. That's why I was seeing a circle. It's cyclical. So there's a cycle to it that's natural. And every human goes through cycles, but it's particularly important to understand the different phases of cycles and processing for someone who's neurodivergent, because there's often this, like for example, in a person who's autistic, when they have a special interest, there's a build to the special interest. And then once they're in the height of it, it's usually often the only thing that they can do, or one of the only things they can think about, talk about. And then for anybody else, it would become exhaustive and they'd want to move on to the next thing. But the autistic brain wants to go into deep focus. So the autistic brain does much better with deep, long thinking versus fast and quick, which is oftentimes why like traditional school settings aren't supportive for that, because they want to put in a lot of different material and jump around. Whereas the autistic brain would prefer to stay in a special interest for an hour, a day, a month, a year, or a lifetime. So for example, astrology is one of my special interests, and I've been doing it every day for 20 years. It seems likely that it's going to be a lifetime special interest, though we never know. There's other special interests that I've had that have only lasted 6 months. So we never know how long it's going to last, but when most other people who are neurotypical would move on in conversation or in schooling or in learning something, the autistic brain wants to stay. And when they get to go into that monotroping and cut out the rest of the world, it's both an extremely satisfying experience, it's a necessary experience, and it's a very soothing experience because it helps regulate the nervous system, because that's how our brains are structured and hardwired. So now let's give a different example here with Moon Neptune. I really love this one because we all, when we think of Moon Neptune in astrology, think of that empathy and emotional permeability that comes with Moon Neptune. So it's the archetype of emotional permeability, imagination, attunement, and the dissolution of boundaries in relationship and emotionally. In a neurodivergent person, Moon Neptune can express itself as a heightened emotional and sensory permeability. I would expect someone who is neurodivergent and Moon Neptune to have even more sensory processing, things that they would need support around because of their already innate heightened sensitivity, both from the archetype of Moon Neptune as that astrological constitution, but then from the neurodivergent constitution that often also can be more sensitive. I have a deep compassion here for people who are Moon Neptune and neurodivergent, because it's like a double dosing of the same thing in a certain kind of way. And so there's often a deep attunement to their atmosphere where they absorb and can even become their atmosphere. The thoughts and feelings they have often is coming from the atmosphere or the environment, the field in which they're in. And so they often need to ask themselves, like, is this my thought? Is this my feeling? Where is this coming from? And so they're very deeply influenced by the people around them in their environment. There's a deep attunement to tone and the unspoken feelings in the unconscious that are present within any relationship or relational matrix that they find themselves in. And there can be a difficulty in filtering emotional input. So like they kind of take it all in, and then there's a process often of overwhelm or the needing to seclude or remove oneself in order to sort or sift through all the different feelings that they're experiencing, not just inside of themselves, but with everybody else around. And so this could look like overwhelm, withdrawal or the need for significant solitude and a ritual to regulate. So in a neurotypical expression of Moon Neptune, you might, in the same configuration, manifest as emotional sensitivity, empathy, imagination, or spiritual longing, but without the same degree of the nervous system flooding that a neurotypical person gets. Now, when you're neurodivergent, you often are surrounded by other people who are neurodivergent because we flock together. There's a magnetism. So a lot of my best friends over my life are also autistic and or ADHD, and they are Moon Neptune. And I've gotten a front row seat to seeing their profound sensitivity and what it takes for them to filter out the time and the energy processing that has to go into filtering what is emotionally going on and what they're experiencing. Now, this can make them incredible space holders or astrologers or therapists. But at the same time, I think part of what got conflated for me in the early years was I just assumed that everyone who was Moon Neptune was experiencing that level of emotional sensitivity and at times overwhelm. And now I recognize that that degree of it on that spectrum was because of being filtered through the neurodivergent neurotype. Okay, I'm going to do one last example here, and that's going to be of Mercury Mars. So the archetype of speed, assertion, and cognition and motion. So in a neurodivergent person, let's think of someone here as ADHD. Mercury Mars may express as like really fast speech, impulsive communication, difficulty slowing thought, or a feeling that ideas need to move now. There can be brilliance and humor and sharpness alongside challenges with timing, interruption, or verbal regulation. Sometimes you'll hear in the Mercury Mars person them interrupting others or even their own thought, like they don't finish their own sentence because they kind of just interrupt it and jump to the next thing. Or verbal regulation, where there can be like really fast speech or like a little bit stuttered because it's all trying to come out so fast. Sometimes when I think of this, I think a little bit of Jonathan Van Ness. I don't know if he has Mercury Mars, but I do know that he identifies from Queer Eye as ADHD, and like that speed in which he speaks, there's a brilliance and humor in it, but it's also like the floodgates open. To me, has a quality of like that Mercury Mars ADHD energy. So I think what's important to highlight here is that what looks like impulsivity in one nervous system actually may be experienced as momentum in another. So the chart doesn't tell us who is neurodivergent. It tells us how archetypal energy organizes, and the neurotype shapes how that organization is lived, regulated, and expressed. So hopefully in sharing some of that, it just helps you to start to think about, if you are neurodivergent, your chart in a bit of a different way. But think it almost like the aperture is wider open. There's not that same filter in place. But if you know someone who is neurodivergent, or you work with people who are neurodivergent, and you are looking at the astrology, I'm hoping that this starts to kind of stimulate or activate some other ways of thinking about it. And again, to encourage all of us as astrologers to not look for specific signatures in a chart and say, oh yeah, that means you're neurodivergent. So I've heard things like, if you're Mercury Uranus or you're Mercury Neptune, then you're neurodivergent. No, anybody, any chart, any person, anywhere can be neurodivergent. It has nothing to do with what the aspects are in the chart in any kind of causal or determining way. And I think this is just very crucial for us to really bring in to the field and the way that we hold and talk about these things. But on the other side, I think it's also very exhilarating to begin to understand some of the gifts of these designations when looking at the natal chart and the unique ways that these astrological configurations can express themselves. I know someone, for example, who's both autistic and ADHD, who has Mercury Uranus, and the sheer brilliance that they bring forward in their truly groundbreaking, innovative ideas. They're at the top of their field. They're a complete pioneer. They're thinking decades in advance. And they've had a lot of fortuitous opportunities to be able to use that gift. And I see the ways in which they at times struggle to regulate and calm their mind, both for themselves, but primarily in relationship, and that it can be difficult sometimes for the people around them to kind of be with and sustain with some of that level of impulsivity that comes with it. And so with every gift, there is a challenge. And I think something that's important when we're thinking about all neurotypes, but when we're thinking about neurodivergence is, yes, these designations, there are gifts in them without a doubt. And at the same time, there's often higher support needs that go with those gifts because of it. My daughter is Mercury Uranus, and like I said, she's autistic, and she has a profound relationship with technology. And it's incredible what she can do with technology. And she's minimally speaking. About 40% of people who are autistic have apraxia, which just means like inside your mind, the words are there, but the connection between the brain and the mouth, it's difficult to get the words out or out in a clear way. And so oftentimes there's need for support there around something like augmented communication in an AAC device. Thank goodness for the technology now of iPads and different programs and apps for AAC communication. But often you see in children like my daughter, they communicate through film and television or song. And so my daughter goes to YouTube and she'll choose a video and she'll play it for me to express to me how she's feeling or what she's thinking. And it's this profound Mercury-Uranus relationship with technology, but it's also not the norm, right? So both already because she's autistic, there's a difference in communication. It's not part of what's considered the normal or the typical in society. And at the same time, Mercury Uranus double doses that, where not only is there communication through technology happening, but it really emphasizes not only the difference of it, but also the speed and rapidity of how quickly she gets things. For example, and this is often true for people who are autistic, we have photographic memories, and that can be visual or sound or both. So auditory or visual. And I often describe it as like a film. I have a film reel in my mind that's like filming everything. And that's part of why, combined with pattern recognition, I'm able to pick up on so much of what's going on, which helps me around working with people, which is one of my special interests, that I can apply my pattern recognition of life, psychology, relationships, people, combine that with astrology, marry the two together, and go back in that film and get a sense of what was being literally spoken and what was unspoken. Now, my daughter has her own version of that where we can go to a place and one time and she will remember everything about that place, where it is, what it is. So she has this spatial temporal mapping. I'll give one last example of this. Our neighbor who used to babysit Luce fosters baby goats. And she brought home 3 goats one time and took our daughter in her front yard. This was 3 years ago around Christmas. And I have a video of my daughter jumping in the yard like the goats, looking just like the baby goats. I'm not kidding you. And this happened one time. I'm not kidding you. 3 years went by to the day, and we were walking around the block, and my daughter went to the yard in the exact same spot where the goats were leaping, and she started leaping like a goat. And the only reason that I had memory of this was because it came up in my videos on my phone of her in this video jumping with the goats on that day. And I had the date and then the image of it. And I was like, oh my God. My husband and I turned to each other. I'm like, she's jumping to the day like the goats in the yard. And so this to me is not only autistic, but it's that neurotype through the Mercury Uranus way. So I just think this creates endless fascination for us as astrologers. I think the different minds that we all have can just do incredible things. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I always love to hear from you. I'd appreciate if you'd like this video, leave a comment, subscribe to my channel. I also wanted to let you know that I started 2 new groups that you can find about at trustpsyche.com. The first one is an astrological mentoring group that's ongoing for professional astrologers, where we do case consultation, chart interpretation, and I support you around everything of the business side of running a successful business as a professional astrologer. And then the second group is a depth psychotherapy astrological consultation group for clinicians who are licensed. It's an ongoing group as well, where we get to do depth work with the application of astrology in the most effective way possible with our clients. Thank you so much. I love being here with you and doing these videos. Thanks for taking the time. Let's close with the ringing bell. All blessings to you.